It's 1962. You're standing in a hobby shop in Michigan. The smell hits you first. Styrene and glue and something almost metallic, like the inside of a new car. You've got allowance money burning a hole in your pocket, and on the shelf in front of you, there's a box, a Ford Thunderbird. 1/25th scale, 3 ways to build it: stock, custom, or race. 98 cents. You take it home. You sit at the kitchen table. You open the box. That kit was made in Troy, Michigan, 12 miles away. At its peak, AMT employed hundreds of workers on Maple Road, producing annual model kits that followed Detroit's new cars year by year. Ford, Chevy, Mopar, as if the hobby shop shelf and the auto show floor were the same place. The system was perfect, and it was already running out of time, because AMT didn't just make model cars. AMT was Detroit, in miniature. Same rivalries, same territorial wars, same dependence on the big three. And when Detroit changed, AMT had nowhere to go. Troy, Michigan, 1948 to 1978. This is the story of the company that put a Ford on every kitchen table in America. And what happened when the real Ford stopped selling? In 1948, Wes Galagli was not thinking about the toy business. He was a Troy, Michigan attorney with a law practice to run, connections to maintain, and a city rebuilding around him. The war was over. The factories that had spent 4 years making tanks and aircraft engines were retooling for peacetime. Detroit was about to enter the greatest automotive boom in American history. And there was a problem. The cars weren't there yet. Post-war demand for automobiles was extraordinary. Returning veterans, growing families, a country that had been rationing rubber and gasoline for 4 years and was now desperate to drive. But the factories couldn't keep up. Showrooms were empty, or nearly so. A customer would walk into a Ford dealership in 1948 and find a handful of cars on the floor. None of them in the color they wanted, none configured the way they'd imagined. The salesman had brochures. He had his pitch, but he didn't have the car. Galagli saw the gap. What if a dealership could show a customer exactly what the new Ford looked like, in every color, with every trim level, without needing the actual vehicle on the floor? Not a photograph, not a drawing, something three-dimensional, something the customer could pick up and turn in their hands. He had connections at Ford Motor Company. He had access to the specifications. And he had one more thing, a contact who could cast aluminum into precise, detailed shapes at a scale small enough to sit on a showroom counter. In 1948, AMT, Aluminum Model Toys, opened its first shop on 8 Mile Road, just outside Detroit. The first product was a 1947-1948 Ford 4-door sedan, cast in aluminum, painted in official Ford factory colors. It was sold exclusively through Ford dealerships. The retail price was $1. It was not a toy. It was a sales tool, a three-dimensional catalog, a way for a customer to see the color they wanted on a car that didn't exist yet in the showroom. Ford dealers understood immediately. The little ones, as one industry slogan of the era put it, sell the big ones. The response was strong enough that Galagli expanded quickly. More Ford models, more colors, more dealerships. But Galagli was still a lawyer. He had a practice to maintain. And running a manufacturing operation, even a small one, required something he didn't have in abundance: time. So, in the early 1950s, he did what any smart founder does when the business outgrows him. He found someone else to run it. The man he hired was George Totef Jr., a skilled pattern maker with an understanding of manufacturing processes that went well beyond what a small promotional model company typically required. Totef had a way of looking at a problem. How do you reproduce the body of a 1953 Chevrolet in 1/25th scale with enough detail that a dealer could show it to a customer and have that customer say, "Yes, that's the car I want," and solving it not just adequately but brilliantly? He would often say to anyone who'd listen that a model car company was very much like an actual automaker. Same engineering departments, same production logic, same obsession with getting the details right before the real thing hit the market. He wasn't wrong. AMT worked closely with Ford's design teams. When a new model was announced, AMT's engineers were working from the same specifications the real stylists used. Scaled clay models first, then larger drawings, then 1/25 scale dies machined to match. Bumpers were chrome-plated, bodies were painted in factory colors and baked in ovens. The models were assembled and packaged before the real vehicles reached the showrooms. Timing was everything. If the 1955 Ford wasn't on the dealer's counter the same week the 1955 Ford arrived in the lot, the promotional had failed its purpose. By the mid-1950s, AMT had moved beyond Ford. Chrysler, Plymouth, Studebaker, the promotional market was expanding, and AMT was expanding with it, moving from outsourced molding at Continental Plastics in Fraser, Michigan, to building deeper in-house capability under Totef's direction. The aluminum era was already over. In 1949, barely a year into AMT's existence, injection plastic molding had become available at the scale AMT needed. Aluminum was expensive, plastic was cheaper, faster, and could be molded in a range of colors that aluminum couldn't match. The name Aluminum Model Toys became an awkward artifact almost immediately, so the company quietly dropped it. They became AMT, just AMT. The aluminum was gone, but the ambition wasn't. What Galagli had started as a side business, a clever gap filler in post-war showrooms, was becoming something larger. Under Totef, AMT was becoming a manufacturer, a real one, with engineering departments, production schedules, licensing relationships with the biggest companies in American industry. And by the late 1950s, George Totef had an idea that would change everything. Not for the dealerships, for the kids. George Totef understood something that Wes Galagli, the attorney, never quite had to think about. A model is not a miniature. A model is an argument. Every curve on the body had to be correct. Every chrome strip had to land in the right place. Every window line had to match the real thing closely enough that a customer standing in a Ford showroom would look at the 1/25th scale version and recognize, without hesitation, the car they were about to spend $2,000 on. That standard, the standard of a tool that sells, drove everything Totef built at AMT. It started with the tooling. The problem with casting promotional models in the early 1950s was complexity. A car body is not a simple shape. It has curves that run in multiple directions simultaneously. It has undercuts, places where the surface turns back on itself, that conventional mold designs couldn't capture without destroying the part when it was ejected. The result in most early promotional models was simplification. Hoods that didn't open. Engines molded as a single undifferentiated block. Bodies that approximated the real thing without quite capturing it. Totef solved it. His innovation, which AMT called the sliding pillar tooling design, allowed the mold to move in multiple directions during ejection, following the contours of the part rather than forcing the part to conform to a simpler mold geometry. It was a mechanical solution to an aesthetic problem. It meant AMT could tool a 1954 Ford with its distinctive wraparound windshield, a shape that had defeated simpler mold designs, and pull it off the line intact, in detail, ready to paint. The auto manufacturers noticed. Ford's design teams began working directly with AMT's engineers. When a new model was announced, and in the 1950s, Detroit announced new models every single year, the annual model change being as ritualized as a liturgical calendar. AMT was brought in early, not after the car was finalized, during development. The process was precise and unforgiving. AMT's engineers would build larger clay models first, working from the manufacturer's specifications, then scaled drawings, then 1/25 scale dies, machined to tolerances that matched the styling intent of the full-size car. The tooling cost for a single model could run anywhere from $20,000 to $250,000, and the auto manufacturers often paid it because the promotional was that valuable to them as a sales instrument. Painted bodies were baked in ovens. Bumpers and hood ornaments were chrome-plated separately, then assembled by hand. The finished model had to be on the dealer's counter the same week, sometimes the same day, that the real car arrived in the lot. Totef ran this operation with the discipline of an automotive engineer, because that's essentially what he was. He had taken Galagli's side business and turned it into a precision manufacturing operation, staffed by pattern makers, tool and die workers, and production specialists who treated 1/25th scale the same way Dearborn treated full size. By the mid-1950s, AMT's promotional models were in dealerships across the country. The model itself had evolved, from aluminum to cellulose acetate plastic, which was cheaper and moldable in color, and then toward styrene, which was dimensionally stable in ways that cellulose acetate never quite managed. Early cellulose acetate models had a tendency to warp over time, the front fenders curling upward at the edges in ways that made them look like they'd been left too close to a heat register. Styrene solved that. The business was working, the system was producing, and Totef, who thought in engineering terms, who saw every problem as a design challenge with a correct solution, began to notice something happening at the edges of their market. Something that the promotional model, that precise, pre-assembled, dealership-only instrument, was not equipped to address. Kids were getting interested in cars, not in owning them, in building them. The hot rod scene in California had exploded through the early 1950s. Magazines like Rod and Custom and Carcraft were selling to teenagers who customized their own vehicles, chopping rooflines, channeling bodies, dropping in performance engines. The same aesthetic was showing up in model form. Kids were buying AMT's promotional models and then taking them apart, cutting them, repainting them, adding parts from other kits, trying to recreate what they saw on the magazine covers. They weren't treating the promotional as a display piece. They were treating it as a starting point. Totef watched this, and in 1958, he sat down with his engineers at the Maple Road plant and asked a question that seems obvious only in hindsight. What if the kit came with the customizing parts already in the box? What if, instead of one way to build it, there were three? The idea was simple enough to explain in one sentence. One box, one car, three ways to build it: stock, custom, or race. What it took to execute that idea was anything but simple. Totef's engineers had to design a single set of tooling that could produce not just the base car body, but an entire ecosystem of optional parts: fender skirts, continental kits, lowering blocks, performance intake manifolds, mag wheels, racing stripes, all engineered to fit the same 1/25th scale body without modification. The instruction sheet had to walk a 12-year-old through three completely different build paths without losing him on any of them. And the price had to stay under $1. They pulled it off. AMT introduced the 3-in-1 Trophy Series kit in 1959, and the hobby market responded in a way the promotional market never had. Dealers hadn't chosen to stock AMT's promotional models. Ford had sent them. But hobby shop owners chose to stock the 3-in-1 kits. They reordered. They called the AMT sales rep and asked what was coming next. Kids came in on Saturday mornings and stood at the counter the way Galagli's customers had stood in Ford showrooms, looking, deciding, spending their allowance. The promotional model had been a sales tool. The 3-in-1 kit was a hobby. And AMT understood almost immediately that a hobby had a different kind of customer than a showroom did. A showroom customer bought once. A hobby customer came back every year, because AMT released new kits every year, following Detroit's annual model changes with the same precision they'd always brought to the promotional business. The 1960 Ford, the 1961 Chevy, the 1962 Pontiac. Year after year, the kits arrived in hobby shops the same season the real cars arrived in dealerships. They called them annuals, and for a generation of American kids, the annual was as reliable as Christmas. To make the customizing kits credible, AMT went directly to the source. George Barris, whose name was on the cover of every custom car magazine in America, became an AMT consultant. His instructions appeared inside the kit boxes. His customizing suggestions, written in the second person, told kids exactly how to replicate what the professionals did. Gene Winfield, whose California shop had produced some of the most radical customs of the era, went further. He closed his shop entirely and moved to work with AMT full-time, heading a speed and custom division that would eventually operate out of Phoenix, Arizona. The Alexander brothers, Detroit's own customizers, whose work appeared regularly in the national magazines, joined the roster. Dean Jeffries came aboard, Alex Krauss, Bill Cushenberry. AMT's instruction sheet started reading less like assembly guides and more like dispatches from a world most kids could only see in photographs. And in the early 1960s, AMT added the figure who would become the public face of the whole operation. His name was Howard Anderson. Everyone called him Bud, and AMT called him the Cat. The story of how he got the name belongs to company lore, told and retold through AMT's marketing materials for years. But what's documented is what he did with it. From 1959 to 1964, Bud Anderson traveled the country attending car shows, model contests, and hobby shop events, creating a kind of promotional energy around AMT's kits that no advertising budget alone could have bought. He wrote columns in model car magazines. He judged contests. He was, in the language of a later era, an influencer, except he was doing it in person in 1961, in a hobby shop in Birmingham, Michigan, with a crowd of 12-year-olds who wanted to know what was coming in next year's catalog. The kits were selling in the hundreds of thousands. But AMT still had a structural problem, and the solution they found to that problem reveals more about how Detroit actually worked than anything else in the company's history. The problem was Chevrolet. AMT's relationship with Ford was deep and long-standing, Gallogly's original connection, the foundation of the whole business. But Chevrolet, which outsold Ford in most years of the 1950s, was reluctant to work directly with a company so visibly tied to their chief competitor, and the promotional model business ran on exclusivity. You didn't make a Chevy kit and a Ford kit under the same brand name. The automakers wouldn't stand for it. So in 1956, AMT did something quietly extraordinary. They helped establish a separate company. Scale Model Products, SMP, was set up with significant AMT financial interest, but operated under its own name, its own branding, its own identity. SMP's purpose was specific, to secure promotional model contracts with Chevrolet and later with Chrysler divisions that AMT couldn't reach directly. On the shelves of a hobby shop or a Chevy dealership, SMP looked like an independent company. Behind the scenes, it was AMT's foot in the door. It worked. And it revealed the unspoken logic of the entire Detroit model car ecosystem. The market hadn't formed organically. It had been structured. AMT held Ford. Johann, founded a year before AMT by Detroit tool and die maker John Hanley, had built its business around Chrysler products, Dodge, Plymouth, DeSoto, and eventually the cars that would become Johann's signature, the great Chrysler full-size cars of the early 1960s, culminating in the 1963 Chrysler Turbine promotional that became the best-selling kit in Johann's history. 3 automakers, 3 model companies, 3 territories. It was not a rivalry in the way the word usually implies. Open warfare, competing for the same ground. It was something more like a system. Each company had its relationships, its contracts, its annual obligations. Each one showed up at the same trade shows, watched the same car reveals, raced to get the same tooling done before the real vehicle hit the showrooms. They competed. But they also depended on each other, on the ecosystem staying intact, on Detroit continuing to change its models every year, on the hobby market continuing to grow, which, in 1963, it still was. But 1963 was also the year that the man who had built AMT's technical foundation walked out the door, and took half the engineering department with him. To understand what happened when George Totef left AMT, you have to understand what the Detroit model car system actually was. It was not a free market. In a free market, any company could approach any automaker and bid for the right to produce their promotional models. The best tooling, the best price, the best relationship wins. That was not how it worked in Detroit in the 1950s and 1960s. What existed instead was something closer to a set of unwritten franchises, territorial agreements enforced not by contract, but by relationship, by history, and by the very practical reality that the automakers themselves had opinions about who made their cars in miniature. Ford had AMT, Chrysler had Johann. General Motors was more complicated, split between AMT's shadow company SMP and later MPC, but the principle was the same. You did not cross the lines, not openly, not without consequences. The system had logic behind it. Tooling a new car model cost tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes $250,000, with the auto manufacturer often footing the bill. That investment made sense only if the model company had a reliable, ongoing relationship with the automaker. You couldn't tool a 1958 Ford, spend 6 months on the dies, and then find out that Ford had decided to give next year's contract to a competitor. The relationships had to be stable, and stable relationships in Detroit meant exclusive ones. Johann's territory is the clearest example of how this worked in practice. John Hanley had started his company in 1947, a year before Galagli opened AMT's doors, making scale models of kitchen sets and transmission demonstrators for Chrysler's engineering department. It was Chrysler work from the beginning. When the promotional model business expanded in the early 1950s, Heinle's company, renamed Joe Hahn after a trademark dispute with the Ideal Toy Company, was already embedded in Chrysler's supplier network. Pontiac came next, then Oldsmobile, then Cadillac, then Studebaker. But Chrysler was always the core. When Heinle received the contract for the 1963 Chrysler turbine car, the futuristic jet engine-powered vehicle that Chrysler had built as a publicity exercise and loaned to selected American families to drive, the promotional model and kit that Hahn produced became the best-selling item in the company's history. The turbine car was exactly what the promotional model system was designed to showcase. Something extraordinary. Something that couldn't be seen at every dealership. Something that made a customer feel like they were holding a piece of the future. Joe Hahn built it. Chrysler was pleased. The relationship held. AMT's relationship with Ford operated on the same principle, except that AMT, under Totef, had pushed deeper into the engineering partnership than any other model company had managed. AMT wasn't just producing models from Ford's specifications. AMT's engineers were in the room during development, working from clay models and styling drawings before the production tooling was even finalized. The 1/25 scale dies and the full-size production dies were sometimes being developed in parallel. That proximity gave AMT an advantage that no competitor could easily replicate. It also gave AMT a dependency that no competitor needed to share. Because when Ford changed, when the annual model change became less dramatic, when the promotional model began losing its value as a dealership sales tool, when the automakers began to question whether they should be paying for miniature versions of their own cars, AMT's deepest asset became its deepest vulnerability. But in the early 1960s, none of that was visible yet. What was visible was growth. Explosive, catalog expanding, hobby shop filling growth. The 3-in-1 kits were selling everywhere. The annuals were reliable sellers. AMT was diversifying. Show rods, custom vehicles, the famous a la carte and Diora kits that brought George Barris's most extreme creations into 1/25th scale. The catalog was thick and getting thicker. And then, in 1963, a group of men sat down together and made a decision that would reshape the entire industry. They were AMT employees, senior ones, engineers, product developers, production specialists, men who had built AMT's technical capability from the inside, who understood the tooling, the licensing, the manufacturing process, the relationships with the automakers. Their leader was George Totef. He was leaving, and he was not leaving alone. The reasons were professional rather than personal. The desire to build something of his own, to apply what he had learned at AMT to a company he controlled. The departure was, by all accounts, handled with the kind of professional courtesy that Detroit's tight-knit manufacturing community required. Bridges were not burned. Relationships were maintained. Totef's new company, Model Products Corporation, MPC, established in Mount Clemens, Michigan, just north of Detroit, would even sell its first kits through AMT's distribution network, packaged in AMT boxes, taking advantage of the brand name and retail relationships that AMT had spent 15 years building. That arrangement said everything about the nature of this industry. Competitors shared distribution. Former employers helped launch the companies that would take their market share. The 1967 MPC Plymouth Barracuda, a promotional originally made for Chrysler, appeared on hobby shop shelves in an AMT box. Nobody found this unusual. This was how Detroit worked, at every level. You competed fiercely within the system. You maintained the system regardless. MPC's first independent kit was a 1/25th scale 1964 Corvette Stingray Coupe, a car AMT already had in its catalog. Totef knew that. He released it anyway, on the calculation that the Corvette was popular enough to support 2 kits in the marketplace. He was right. And from that moment, the Detroit model car system had 3 full players instead of 2. AMT held Ford, Joe Hahn held Chrysler. MPC, Totef's company, built from AMT's own talent and expertise, began working its way into General Motors, establishing the relationships with Chevrolet and Pontiac that would make it, by 1970, as prominent in hobby shops as AMT itself. The territorial carve-up was complete. 3 companies, three automakers, one ecosystem, finely balanced and mutually dependent. What none of them could see, what none of them had any particular reason to anticipate in 1963, with the market expanding and the kits selling and the annuals arriving on schedule every fall, was that the entire structure rested on two assumptions: that Detroit would keep changing its cars every year, and that American kids would keep wanting to build them. Both assumptions were about to be tested. But before the testing began, AMT made the most improbable bet in the history of the American model kit industry. They decided to build a starship. The men who left AMT in 1963 were not disgruntled employees. That distinction matters. In the mythology of corporate departures, the founding team that walks out is usually fleeing something: bad management, broken promises, a vision that the parent company refused to support. The AMT exodus was not that story. George Toteff had spent more than a decade building AMT into a precision manufacturing operation. He had invented the tooling systems. He had established the automaker relationships. He had turned a lawyer's side business into the dominant force in American promotional model production. He left because he wanted to build something of his own. Phil Sheldon went with him as chief engineer, Ed Dietz as new product engineer, Paul Simon as shop manager. The four men who had been responsible for the technical and production core of AMT walked out together and incorporated Model Products Corporation in Mount Clemens, Michigan, a small industrial city 20 miles northeast of Detroit, close enough to the automaker networks to maintain relationships, far enough from Troy to establish a distinct identity. The parting, by every account, was handled with the careful courtesy that Detroit's manufacturing community enforced on itself. Everyone knew everyone: the tool and die workers, the pattern makers, the production specialists. They all moved in the same professional circles, attended the same trade shows, used the same suppliers. You did not burn bridges in a city where the bridges led everywhere you needed to go. So Toteff called AMT's management. Arrangements were made. MPC's first kits, before the new company had built its own distribution network, before hobby shop buyers knew the MPC name, would be sold through AMT's existing channels, packaged in AMT boxes, carrying AMT's established retail relationships into stores across the country. Read that again slowly. The company that had just lost its entire senior engineering team was now helping that team's new company reach customers. AMT's own sales force was putting MPC product on shelves, because that was how the system worked. Because the alternative, cutting off MPC, refusing the arrangement, treating the departure as a hostile act, would have damaged relationships and disrupted a distribution network that AMT needed for its own products. Cooperation was not generosity. It was self-interest, correctly understood. MPC's first independent kit was a 1/25th scale 1964 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray Coupe. AMT already had a Corvette in its catalog. Toteff released his anyway. The Corvette was that popular, a car so central to American automotive culture in the early 1960s that two competing 1/25th scale versions could coexist on the same hobby shop shelf without cannibalizing each other. He was right. Both sold. And from that first Corvette, MPC moved fast. Toteff had retained his relationship with Dean Jeffries, the California customizer whose work had appeared in AMT's kit instructions for years. That relationship produced one of the most successful model car kits of the entire decade. Jeffries' Monkey Mobile, the customized Pontiac GTV built for the Monkees television series. MPC released it in the mid-1960s, and it sold in numbers that demonstrated exactly what Toteff had always understood about the hobby market. Kids didn't just want cars, they wanted famous cars. Cars with stories attached, cars they'd seen on television, at the drag strip, on the cover of a magazine. The Monkey Mobile was all three. It was the car from a television show that every kid in America was watching, customized by a man whose name appeared in the hobby press, built to a standard of detail that reflected everything Toteff had learned at AMT. MPC built its business on that insight. By 1965, MPC had secured its first promotional model contracts, with Dodge pulling those contracts away from Joe Hahn, breaking the territorial boundaries that had defined the industry for a decade. It was the first significant redistribution of automaker relationships since the system had solidified. Joe Hahn lost Dodge. MPC gained a foothold in Chrysler's territory. The lines that had seemed permanent began to blur. Meanwhile, back in Troy, AMT was absorbing the consequences of the exodus. The engineering talent was gone. The day-to-day production could continue, the tooling existed, the relationships with Ford and the other manufacturers were intact. The distribution network was running. But the creative and technical leadership that had driven AMT's expansion through the late 1950s and early 1960s was now sitting in a building in Mount Clemens, working on MPC's next catalog. AMT responded the way any organization responds to sudden talent loss, by promoting from within, by hiring replacements, by doubling down on what had worked. The annual kits kept coming. The custom show rod kits kept coming. Bud Anderson kept traveling and evangelizing. The catalog kept growing. But the trajectory had changed. Where AMT had been accelerating, more kits, more innovation, deeper automaker relationships, expanding into new categories, it was now consolidating, defending what it had built rather than building further. And the market, which had seemed infinitely expandable in 1963, was beginning to show its limits. The kids who had bought AMT's first 3-in-1 kits in 1959 and 1960 were teenagers by the mid-1960s. Teenagers who were less interested in model kits than they were in real cars, real girls, real jobs. The hobby was still growing. New kids were entering it every year, but the growth rate was no longer what it had been. The curve was flattening. AMT needed something to counter that flattening, something that wasn't a car, something that could reach the parts of the market that the annual Ford kits and the Chrysler promotionals couldn't touch. In August 1966, they found it. In the most unlikely place imaginable, a Hollywood production company named Desilu had a television show scheduled to premiere on NBC that September. It was set in space, aboard a starship called the Enterprise. The show's producer needed help building a full-scale model of a shuttlecraft for filming. AMT's sales department saw an opportunity. The meeting that followed would change everything. On August 1, 1966, a man named Don Beebe signed a contract at Desilu Productions in Hollywood. Beebe represented AMT. The contract gave AMT the rights to produce plastic model kits based on a television series that had not yet aired. The series was called Star Trek. Almost nobody outside the production had seen it. The network had ordered it, scheduled it, and was preparing to launch it in September. But in August of 1966, Star Trek was not a cultural phenomenon. It was a bet. AMT was making a second one. The company that had built its entire identity on Ford Thunderbirds and Chevy Corvettes, on the annual ritual of Detroit's new car season, on the precise engineering of 1/25th scale promotional models, that company had just licensed a science fiction television show, a show set in the 23rd century, a show with no cars in it at all. The deal had come together through an AMT marketing contact named Stephen Poe, who had been retained by the company for advertising and communications work. Poe had a connection to the Star Trek production, and he understood something that AMT's core business had not yet fully grasped, that the model kit customer of 1966 was not exclusively a car kid. He was a kid, and kids in 1966 were watching television with an intensity that the hobby market had not yet learned to exploit. The terms of the agreement were unusual even by the standards of the industry. AMT would receive the rights to produce Star Trek model kits for the American market. In exchange, AMT would help Desilu with something the production desperately needed: physical set pieces. Specifically, a full-scale exterior of the Galileo shuttlecraft, the smaller vessel carried aboard the Enterprise, and the interior filming set to go with it. Star Trek's producer, Robert Justman, had been watching the budget for the upcoming episode The Galileo 7 spiral out of control. The sets were expensive. AMT's offer arrived, in Justman's words, at a time when everyone thought all was lost. AMT built the shuttlecraft. Desilu got its sets. AMT got its license. The negotiations were handled by Edwin Pearlstein, Director of Business Affairs at Desilu, and Don Beebe on AMT's side. The details were specific enough that they've been documented precisely. August 1st, 1966, the date the contract closed, is recorded in Star Trek's production history as the beginning of what would become one of the longest-running franchise licensing relationships in American entertainment. AMT did not know that yet. In August 1966, they knew only that they had a license and a production schedule to meet. The engineering challenge was significant. AMT's model designers had spent 18 years reproducing cars, objects they could measure, photograph from every angle, obtain specifications for from the manufacturer. The Enterprise was different. It existed only as a full-size filming model, constructed by the Dieselou production team to Gene Roddenberry's design. There were no specifications in the conventional sense. There were no manufacturer's drawings to work from. What there was, crucially, was Matt Jeffries. Jeffries was Star Trek's art director, the man who had designed the Enterprise's distinctive shape, the wide saucer section, and the twin warp nacelles, the visual language of the ship. When AMT needed construction plans for the first 3 outings in their Star Trek model kit line, Jeffries drew them up himself, in his spare time, working with Poe in the early stages of the project. His drawings became the basis for AMT's tooling. The 1/25th scale was not practical for a starship the size of the Enterprise. AMT settled on 1/650th, a scale that produced a model roughly 18 inches long, large enough to show meaningful detail, small enough to sit on a bedroom shelf. The kit number was S921. The first version included something no AMT car kit had ever offered: a battery-operated lighting system. The bridge dome on top of the primary saucer could be illuminated. The warp nacelle caps could glow. A kid could build the Enterprise and then turn out the bedroom lights and hold a lit starship in his hands. No Ford Thunderbird had ever done that. The Enterprise model reached store shelves in April 1967, 7 months after the show had premiered during Star Trek's first season on NBC. By that point, the show had developed the kind of devoted audience that television executives of the era didn't yet have a name for. It was not the largest audience. It was the most intense one. Viewers who watched Star Trek did not merely watch it, they thought about it, wrote about it, argued about it, and, as AMT was about to discover, bought merchandise related to it in extraordinary numbers. In the first year of release, AMT sold more than 1 million Enterprise kits. 1 million in a single year for a single kit, based on a television show that the network had nearly canceled before it finished its first season. The number reframed everything AMT thought it understood about its own market. The annual Ford kits, the backbone of the business, the products that had defined AMT since 1959, sold well. Reliably, year after year, in the tens of thousands. The Enterprise sold 1 million in 12 months, and the orders kept coming. AMT requested an expansion of its licensing agreement almost immediately. Dieselou agreed. The next kit was the Klingon battlecruiser, the D7 class warship that had appeared in the show's first season. Its design was drawn by Matt Jeffries himself, specifically for AMT's kit, and the design was so striking that Star Trek's producers adopted it for use in the 3rd season of the show. A model company's product influenced the television series it had licensed. That had never happened in the car kit business. The Klingon kit followed the Enterprise onto shelves in 1968, and sold with the same intensity. AMT had stumbled into something the hobby industry would spend the next 2 decades trying to understand: the science fiction model kit market, which operated on entirely different dynamics than the car kit market, where accuracy to a real vehicle mattered less than fidelity to a fictional one, where the customer was not comparing the model to something in a showroom, but to something in their imagination. Aurora recognized the opportunity almost immediately. Unable to sell Star Trek kits in the United States, AMT held the American license. Aurora negotiated an agreement to lease AMT's molds for international markets. From 1966 to 1972, Aurora released the same Enterprise and Klingon cruiser kits outside the United States, using AMT's tooling with packaging so similar that the 2 versions were nearly indistinguishable. The arrangement was reciprocal. Aurora had produced a Spock figure kit for the international market, and AMT eventually obtained the rights to release it domestically, buying the tooling from Aurora outright in 1976. 2 of the biggest names in American model kit history, sharing molds, trading licenses, building the same market from opposite ends. This was the model kit industry at its most collaborative, and its most vulnerable, because the Star Trek boom, as extraordinary as it was, could not solve the structural problems that were accumulating beneath AMT's surface. The promotional model business, the foundation on which everything had been built, was in measurable decline. Detroit was still changing its cars every year, but the automakers had begun to question the cost of the promotional model program. The little ones that sell the big ones were becoming expensive to produce, and the dealerships, which had once received them as free sales tools, were beginning to charge customers for them. The dynamics that had made the promotional model an obvious investment in 1950 were eroding by 1965. AMT had seen this coming. The move into kit production, the 3-in-1 series, the annuals, the showrod kits, had been, in part, a response to it. The Star Trek license was a further response, an attempt to find customers who were not dependent on Detroit's annual model calendar. AMT added trucks to its catalog in 1969. The California Hauler 359, a Peterbilt tractor-trailer kit so precisely engineered that AMT had copied the design directly from Peterbilt's manufacturer specifications. Fire trucks followed in 1971, American LaFrance ladder trucks and pumpers, tooled with the same precision that Totef had brought to the Ford promotional models. Each expansion was a hedge. Each new category was AMT saying, "We are not only a car company." But the kid who had stood at the hobby shop counter in 1962, choosing between the Ford Thunderbird and saving his allowance for another week, that kid was growing up. By 1968, he was in high school. By 1972, he was working on real cars, not model ones. The next generation of kids was coming up behind him, but their relationship to the hobby was different. Less intense, more fragmented, more easily distracted by the other things competing for their attention and their allowance money. AMT's catalog for 1969 was remarkable in its breadth. Cars, trucks, sci-fi, show rods, fire apparatus, figures, a company trying to be everything to every modeler in America. It was also, in retrospect, the catalog of a company that had lost the singular focus that had made it great. The Starship gamble had paid off beyond any reasonable expectation. The Enterprise kit would remain in production, in various forms, for decades. AMT's association with Star Trek, the oldest and longest surviving franchise licensing relationship in Star Trek's history, would outlast the Troy plant, outlast Lesney, outlast Ertl, and survive into the 21st century under Round 2's ownership. But a million Enterprise kits could not save a system that was failing at its roots. The automakers were pulling back. The promotional market was dying. And the hobby market, the vast, energetic, catalog-driven hobby market that Totef and Barris and Bud the Cat had built through the early 1960s, was beginning to contract in ways that no single licensing deal, however spectacular, could reverse. The question was no longer whether AMT's original business model would survive. The question was how long the company had before someone noticed. The decline did not arrive like a plant closure. It arrived like a tide going out, slowly, incrementally, so gradually that the people standing on the shore were not certain it was happening until they looked down and found the water gone. In 1965, AMT was the dominant force in American model car production. Its annual kits were in every hobby shop in the country. Its promotional models were in Ford showrooms from Maine to California. Its catalog was the broadest in the industry. The 3-in-1 Trophy Series had created a hobby market where none had existed before, and that market was still growing. By 1972, AMT had produced its last dealer promotional model. 24 years after Wes Galagli had cast the first aluminum Ford four-door sedan for a Detroit showroom, the business that had made AMT possible no longer existed in the form that had sustained it. The end of the promotional model was not a single decision made by a single executive. It was the accumulated weight of a dozen separate pressures, each one manageable in isolation, collectively fatal. The first was a simple economics, tooling a new promotional model for each year's vehicles, designing the dies, machining them to the tolerances that Ford and Chrysler and GM demanded, producing the models in quantities that made the program viable, cost money that had once been justified by the sales value the promotional delivered. In the early 1950s, a free miniature car on a showroom counter was a genuine competitive advantage. By the mid-1960s, showrooms were full. The post-war shortage that had made the promotional model a necessity had long since ended. Customers had choices. The little model on the counter was pleasant, but it was no longer moving metal the way it once had. The automakers noticed. Ford, which had once paid a significant portion of AMT's tooling costs as a matter of course, began to scrutinize those payments. The promotional model program was a marketing expense, and marketing expenses could be cut. The second pressure was the oil embargo of 1973. When OPEC cut oil supplies to the United States in October of that year, the American automotive industry entered a crisis it would not fully resolve for a decade. Fuel prices quadrupled. Long lines formed at gas stations. Suddenly, the large, powerful, highly detailed American cars that had been the core of AMT's catalog, the muscle cars, the full-size sedans, the personal luxury coupes, were exactly the wrong product at exactly the wrong moment. Detroit responded by downsizing. The 1974 model year brought smaller engines and reduced performance across the board. The 1975 models brought catalytic converters and federally mandated safety equipment. The cars that had made AMT's annuals aspirational, the cars that a kid wanted on his shelf because he wanted to be the man who drove one, were being replaced by vehicles engineered primarily for fuel economy and regulatory compliance. A model kit of a 1975 Ford Granada did not carry the same charge as a model kit of a 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1. This was not a trivial distinction. The emotional power of the annual kit had always depended on the emotional power of the real car it represented. When Detroit built exciting cars, AMT's kits were exciting objects. When Detroit built appliances, AMT's kits became miniature appliances. The hobby didn't die, but the energy went out of it in ways that were visible in hobby shop foot traffic, in reorder rates, in the length of time a kit sat on the shelf before selling. The third pressure was demographic, and it was the most fundamental of all. The generation that had made AMT's fortune, the boys born between roughly 1945 and 1955, who had discovered model kits in their early teens and driven the explosive growth of the hobby market through the late 1950s and 1960s, had grown up. By the early 1970s, they were in their 20s. Some of them were working on real cars. Some were starting families. A few were still modelers. The hobby retained a dedicated adult enthusiast base, but they were no longer the mass market that the annual kit had been designed to serve. The next generation of boys, born in the late 1950s and early 1960s, coming of age in the mid-1970s, had more choices competing for their attention and their allowance money than their older brothers had faced. Model kits were one option among many, and one option in particular was beginning to exert a gravitational pull that the hobby market had no answer for: electronic games. In 1972, Atari released Pong. In 1976, the Fairchild Channel F brought programmable home gaming to American living rooms. In 1977, the Atari 2600 arrived, a machine that could play multiple games, that plugged into the family television, that offered something a model kit fundamentally could not: immediate gratification. No glue, no paint, no waiting overnight for the cement to cure, no losing the canopy piece under the refrigerator. Just plug in the cartridge and play. The boys who might have spent a Saturday afternoon building an AMT Ford pickup were spending it with Atari joysticks instead. AMT saw this and diversified further. The truck kits that had begun in 1969 expanded through the 1970s into a substantial product line: Peterbilt, Kenworth, White, Autocar, GMC Astro, Chevrolet Titan. The big rig had a different audience than the muscle car. Older modelers, enthusiasts with a professional connection to trucking, men who drove these vehicles for a living and wanted a precise replica of their own rig on the shelf above the workbench. It was a real market. AMT served it well. NASA and space-themed kits followed the Star Trek line into the catalog. Vans arrived in the mid-1970s, tapping into the customizing culture that had shifted from cars to full-size vans as the decade's preferred canvas for personal expression. AMT produced van kits with the same customizing parts philosophy that had made the 3-in-1 kit successful 15 years earlier: multiple build options, aftermarket accessories, room for the builder to impose their own vision. Each category found its audience. None of them replaced what the car kit market had been at its peak. MPC was running the same race, with the same results. Johan, smaller and less diversified, was running it slower and with less room to maneuver. The entire Detroit model car ecosystem was contracting. Not collapsing, but tightening, losing the margins that had made expansion possible, losing the hobby shop accounts as some stores closed and others reduced their model kit sections to make room for electronic games and the accessories that went with them. And through all of it, the Troy, Michigan plant on Maple Road kept running. The workers came in, the tooling ran, the kits came off the line and went into boxes and went into the distribution network and reached hobby shops and were sold in smaller quantities than before, with thinner margins than before, with less certainty about next year's catalog than there had been at any point since the early 1950s. The company was not failing, not yet, but it was no longer the operation it had been. The annual was still an annual, but the energy behind it, the sense that the new Ford kit arriving in September was an event, something worth standing at the hobby shop counter for, had diminished. The kids who were buying model kits in 1976 were buying them for different reasons than the kids of 1962 had bought them. More quietly, more privately, less as participants in a shared cultural ritual, and more as individuals pursuing a personal interest. The hobby had survived, the moment was gone. In 1977, with the promotional model business dead, with the kit market contracted, with Tamiya's Japanese precision kits beginning to appear on American hobby shop shelves and demonstrate in unmistakable terms what injection-molded plastic could achieve when a manufacturer invested in modern tooling. In 1977, someone began making inquiries about AMT. The inquiry came from Britain, from a company called Lesney Products, the makers of Matchbox. Lesney Products understood toys. What they did not understand, what nothing in their history had prepared them to understand, was the difference between a toy and a hobby. The distinction sounds philosophical. In practice, it was the difference between a company that survived and one that didn't. Lesney had been founded in 1947 in London by two friends, Leslie Smith and Rodney Smith, who had no family connection despite sharing a surname. They had built their business on Matchbox, the small die-cast metal vehicles sold in boxes the size of a matchbox, priced cheaply enough that a child could buy one with pocket change. Matchbox cars were toys in the purest sense, durable, simple, immediately gratifying, requiring nothing from the child who owned them except the desire to play. You didn't build a Matchbox car. You didn't paint it. You didn't consult an instruction sheet. You took it out of the box and drove it across the kitchen floor. By the mid-1970s, Lesney had made Matchbox one of the most recognized toy brands in the world. Their die-cast vehicles were sold in more than 100 countries. Their London factory was producing tens of millions of units per year. They were, by any reasonable measure, a success. But the toy market was changing. Hot Wheels, Mattel's die-cast line, launched in 1968 with low-friction wheels and a vivid color palette designed to appeal to the same demographic Matchbox had always owned, had taken a significant portion of Lesney's market. The competition had forced Matchbox to respond, to invest in new tooling and new designs, to try to match Hot Wheels' energy with a product line that had been built on a different philosophy entirely. The response was expensive and only partially successful. By the late 1970s, Lesney was feeling the strain. And so, as companies under financial pressure often do, they looked for an acquisition that could expand their revenue base, diversify their product line, and demonstrate to investors that growth was still possible. They looked at the American hobby market, which was large and established and had brand names that American consumers recognized. They looked at AMT, which had those brand names, those retail relationships, that catalog. They made an offer. AMT's ownership accepted. In 1978, Lesney Products purchased AMT, the Troy, Michigan plant on Maple Road, the facility that George Toteff had built into a precision manufacturing operation over 25 years, the place where the 3-in-1 kit had been invented, where the Star Trek Enterprise had been tooled, where hundreds of workers had spent their careers producing the annual kits that defined American model car culture, was assessed as a facility and found wanting. Lesney's production logic was built around high-volume, low-cost die-cast manufacturing. Their facilities in Britain ran at scales and efficiencies that the Maple Road plant, designed for the specific demands of injection-molded plastic kit production, could not match. The decision was made to consolidate. Production would move to Baltimore, Maryland, where Lesney had existing operations. The Troy plant would close. The workers were told. Some transferred. Many did not. When the Maple Road facility shut down, it took with it something that had no line item on Lesnie's balance sheet. AMT had maintained, at its Troy headquarters, an extraordinary collection, a display of models and documentary history that represented the entire arc of the company's 30 years of production. Promotional models from the late 1940s, early 3-in-1 kits, show rod models, enterprise kits, the physical record of what AMT had made and how it had evolved. When Lesnie took over and production moved to Baltimore, that collection was scattered. Not destroyed, scattered, dispersed. Pieces went to employees, to collectors, to storage, to places unknown. The institutional memory of AMT, assembled over 3 decades, was broken apart in the transition the way a model kit is broken apart when the box is opened and the sprues are cut and the pieces are laid out on the table, except that these pieces were never reassembled. The workers who had built AMT's kits for years found themselves without the plant that had employed them. The hobby community, which had no formal mechanism for responding to a corporate acquisition, continued buying AMT kits, the same kits now produced in Baltimore, with the same box art, the same part numbers, the same familiar smell of styrene when you open the sealed bag. But the kits were no longer made in Michigan, and the people who had made them in Michigan were no longer making them. Lesnie's ownership of AMT lasted 5 years. Not because AMT failed. The brand continued to produce kits. The catalog continued to exist. The Baltimore operation continued to run. AMT failed because Lesnie failed, and Lesnie failed for reasons that had nothing to do with model kits. The Hot Wheels competition had hurt Matchbox more than Lesnie's public statements acknowledged. The company had invested heavily in new tooling and new manufacturing capacity to respond to Mattel, and the investment had not produced the revenue increase needed to service the debt it created. The global toy market was softening. Lesnie's costs were rising. The financial structure that had supported the world's largest die-cast toy manufacturer was beginning to crack. In 1982, Lesnie Products went into receivership in the United Kingdom. The bankruptcy proceedings that followed were the kind that toy company historians write about. The unraveling of a brand that had been in continuous production for 35 years. The sale of assets to satisfy creditors. The end of the original Matchbox operation as an independent entity. Hot Wheels had not killed Matchbox. Matchbox's own financial decisions, made under the pressure of competing with Hot Wheels, had done that. AMT was a subsidiary. When the parent collapsed, AMT went into the receivership alongside it. Not because there was anything fundamentally wrong with the model kit business, but because that is what happens to subsidiaries when the parent's creditors take control. The Ertl Company moved quickly. Ertl was based in Dyersville, Iowa, a small city that had become, improbably, the home of one of America's most successful makers of die-cast farm equipment replicas and licensed vehicle toys. Ertl understood the model and toy vehicle business. They understood tooling, licensing, retail distribution, and they understood that AMT's catalog, the tooling for hundreds of kits, the licensing agreements with Ford and Desilu, and dozens of other properties, was worth considerably more than Lesnie's receivership proceedings were valuing it at. In March 1982, Ertl purchased AMT's assets from Lesnie's receivers. The AMT Ertl brand was established. The Baltimore production operation continued. The catalog was maintained, and in the early 1980s, Ertl began reissuing classic AMT kits alongside new production, bringing back the muscle car annuals and the truck kits and the Star Trek line, recognizing that the collector market for these products was real and growing even as the mass hobby market contracted. A couple of years later, when General Mills decided to divest from its toy and hobby holdings, Ertl made a second acquisition, MPC, the company that George Totef had built from AMT's own talent, the company that had competed with AMT for 20 years across the hobby shop shelves of America, was now under the same corporate roof as AMT itself. The Detroit system's two great rivals, AMT and MPC, were now the same company. In Dyersville, Iowa, it was the final confirmation that the world those companies had been built for no longer existed. The territorial carve-up of the Big Three promotional contracts, the annual race to get the new Ford or the new Chevy tooled before the showroom reveal, the hobby shop ecosystem where Bud the Cat could drive from city to city and find kids lined up at the counter, all of it was gone. What remained were the brands, the tooling, and the collector market that had formed around the kits those brands had once produced. The Troy plant on Maple Road had been torn down. The workers had scattered into other industries, other careers, other lives. The documentary history that AMT had assembled over 30 years had been dispersed when Lesney moved production to Baltimore and could not be recovered. What survived was the tooling. Steel and iron, machined to tolerances that had not relaxed with age. The dies for the 1965 Ford Mustang Fastback. The dies for the Peterbilt 359. The dies for the Enterprise. The same tooling, refined and corrected through multiple reissue cycles, that Don Beebe had commissioned in 1966 when he signed the contract at Desilu and committed AMT to building a Starship. The tooling had outlasted the plant. It had outlasted the company. It had outlasted 2 separate corporate bankruptcies and multiple ownership changes spanning 4 decades. And in 2012, when Round 2 LLC of South Bend, Indiana purchased the tooling and brands outright, the molds that George Totef's engineers had cut in Troy, Michigan in the early 1960s were still capable of producing kits. They still are. In the model kit business, the mold is everything. Not the brand name, not the box art, not the instruction sheet or the decal paper or the catalog photograph. The mold, the steel tooling machined to precise tolerances from which every part of every kit is pulled, is the irreducible core of the operation. If the mold survives, the kit can be reproduced. If the mold is lost, damaged, or destroyed, the kit is gone in a way that no amount of corporate reorganization or brand revival can address. Aurora's molds were auctioned in a parking lot in West Hempstead in 1977 and scattered to buyers across 3 continents. Some were purchased by foreign manufacturers and used to produce inferior reissues. Some were stored improperly and rusted. Some were lost entirely. The Aurora Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, the monster kits that defined a generation of American childhood, exist today in reproduction form precisely because their mold survived, but survived, damaged, and diminished, producing kits that collectors can identify immediately as inferior to the originals. AMT's story went differently. When Lesney moved AMT's production from Troy to Baltimore in 1978, the tooling moved with it. Not scattered, not auctioned, moved as production assets, as the operational core of a manufacturing business that Lesney intended to continue running. The molds for the annual car kits, the truck kits, the Star Trek line, the show rods, the fire apparatus, all of it transferred to Baltimore intact. When Lesney went into receivership in 1982 and Ertl purchased AMT's assets, the tooling transferred again, from Baltimore to Dyersville, Iowa, or more precisely, to whatever production facilities Ertl was using at the time, since Ertl's manufacturing arrangements were more complex than a single plant location suggests. But the key fact remained: the tooling was part of the asset package. It had financial value. It was protected accordingly. This was not guaranteed. Receivership proceedings are not known for their sensitivity to the cultural significance of steel dies. Creditors want liquid assets, cash, receivables, inventory that can be converted quickly. Tooling is a liquid. It takes up space. It requires specialized knowledge to operate. In a bankruptcy liquidation, tooling frequently goes to scrap because the cost of storing and maintaining it exceeds whatever a buyer will pay. AMT's tooling did not go to scrap. Ertl understood what it had purchased: the catalog value of AMT's tool library, the ability to reissue the 1965 Mustang Fastback, the Peterbilt 359, the Enterprise, was real and demonstrable. Collectors were already paying premium prices for original AMT kits on the secondary market. The market was telling anyone who was listening that these products had ongoing commercial value, not just sentimental value. Ertl began reissuing classic AMT kits alongside new production almost immediately after the acquisition. The muscle car annuals came back. The truck kits came back. The Star Trek line continued without interruption. The Enterprise kit that Don Beebe had licensed from Desilu in 1966 was still in production under AMT Ertl, still selling, still accumulating the reissue history that would eventually make it one of the most produced model kit subjects in American hobby history. When General Mills divested its hobby holdings and Ertl acquired MPC, the tooling from both companies resided under the same corporate ownership for the first time. AMT's Ford-oriented catalog and MPC's GM-oriented catalog, the two halves of the Detroit promotional system that Totef had separated when he left AMT in 1963, were reunited in Iowa. Competitors for 20 years, now cataloged together, their tooling stored in the same facilities, their reissue schedules managed by the same production team. The irony was not lost on the collector community, which had followed the corporate history of both brands with the kind of attention that automotive historians give to merger activity among the real automakers. Ertl's ownership lasted until the company itself was sold to RC2 Corporation, later rebranded as Learning Curve International, and the focus of the new ownership shifted toward die-cast collectibles rather than plastic model kits. The kit brands, AMT, MPC, were not priorities. Production continued, but without the investment in new tooling or catalog development that a healthy model kit business requires. The reissues kept coming, but the energy behind them was maintenance rather than growth. And then, in 2009, a man named Thomas Lowe entered into an exclusive licensing agreement for the AMT property, including MPC. Lowe had founded Round 2 LLC in South Bend, Indiana. He was, in the language that the Round 2 corporate history uses without embarrassment, a model car guy. He had grown up with these kits. He understood what they were, what they had been, what the collector community wanted from them. The licensing agreement was the beginning of a process that concluded in 2012 when Round 2 purchased the tooling and brands outright, paying for the physical molds, the brand names, the licensing agreements, the entire accumulated asset base of what had once been AMT, MPC, and by extension, the original Detroit model car ecosystem. Round 2's South Bend facility became, at that moment, one of the most historically significant addresses in American hobby history. Under one roof, in Indiana, sat the tooling for AMT's complete catalog, the tooling for MPC's complete catalog, the Polar Lights brand, itself a revival of Aurora's old monster kit molds, purchased separately and brought into the Round 2 family, the Lindbergh brand, the Hawk brand, Aurora, AMT, MPC, Lindbergh, Hawk, 5 of the names that had defined American model kit culture from the 1950s through the 1970s, companies that had competed with each other across decades, that had fought over automaker contracts and hobby shop shelf space and the allowance money of successive generations of American boys, were now all part of the same catalog, managed by the same company, their tooling stored in the same building. The Detroit system had ended. The molds had survived it. Round 2 began producing classic AMT reissues with a seriousness of purpose that the collector community recognized immediately. The 1962 Buick Electra 225, the 1961 Ford Galaxy Skyline, the original box art reproduced faithfully, the original part numbers maintained where possible, the white wall tires and metal axles and chassis screws that the originals had included brought back into the reissue versions. The kits that came off Round 2's production line were not identical to the originals. Tooling that has been used for 50 years shows its age, and the production processes of 2012 were not the production processes of 1962. But they were recognizable. A collector who had built the original 1962 Buick Electra kit as a 12-year-old in suburban Michigan could pick up Round 2's reissue and find, in the weight of the sprue and the fit of the parts and the layout of the instruction sheet, something continuous with what he remembered. That continuity, fragile, imperfect, commercially driven rather than archival in intent, was nonetheless real. The molds had made it possible. The molds that George Totef's engineers had cut in Troy, Michigan in the early 1960s, that had moved to Baltimore with Lesney, that had transferred to Iowa with Ertl, that had waded through the RC 2 years of diminished attention, that had finally found their way to South Bend with Round 2. 60 years of corporate history, 5 ownership changes, 2 bankruptcies. The tooling survived all of it. In the model kit business, the mold is everything. And AMT's molds, unlike Aurora's, unlike Johann's, unlike the molds of a dozen smaller companies that had entered and exited the hobby market in the post-war decades, are still cutting plastic today. That is not a small thing. In a niche where the default ending is loss, molds auctioned, scattered, rusted, gone, AMT's tooling survival is the exception that proves the rule. And it means that the kits West Gallogley's company first produced in Troy, Michigan, in the years when the showrooms were empty and the little ones sold the big ones, are still available. Not in the form they once took, not from the plant that made them, not by the hands that cut the dies and pulled the parts and packaged them for the hobby shop shelf, but available, which is more than most can say. Johann closed in 1991, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a parking lot auction or a newspaper headline. The company simply stopped. The contracts had dried up years earlier. The promotional model business that John Hanley had built from a Detroit tool shop in 1947, that had given America the 1963 Chrysler turbine car in miniature, that had tooled the great Chrysler full-size cars of the early 1960s with a precision that rivaled anything AMT produced for Ford, was gone. The molds went to a Detroit-area plastics company called Seville, then to a collector named Okie Spaulding in Covington, Kentucky, who bought the Johann brand and Tooling in 2000 and put some classics back into limited production. Then, effectively, nothing. Johann's story is the Detroit system story without the happy ending. No Erdl to step in. No round two to provide a permanent home. Just the slow diminishment of a company that had been built entirely around a set of automaker relationships. Chrysler, Cadillac, Oldsmobile, AMC, Studebaker, that ceased to value what Johann provided long before Johann ceased to exist. MPC lasted longer, in corporate form, but the original MPC, Totef's company, the operation he had built in Mount Clemens from AMT's own talent, had effectively ended when General Mills sold it to Erdl in the mid-1980s. The brand survived, the catalog survived, the tooling survived, as we have seen, all the way to round two. But the company as a creative enterprise, as a place where engineers and product developers made decisions about what kits to tool and how to tool them, had been absorbed and subsumed into the larger corporate structure that owned it. What the Detroit system left behind, in its collapse, was a lesson about the difference between a business and an institution. AMT, at its peak, was both. It was a business, generating revenue, paying workers, servicing contracts, producing product. And it was an institution, a place that had cultural significance beyond its financial performance, that had shaped the way a generation of American boys understood cars, that had created objects so resonant that 50 years after their production, collectors were paying hundreds of dollars for original examples in good condition. The business failed, the institution did not. That distinction is worth sitting with, because it runs counter to the way we usually talk about corporate collapse. When a company closes, we say it failed, and in a financial sense, it did. But the failure of AMT's Troy operation, the closing of the Maple Road plant, the dispersal of the workforce, the transfer of production to Baltimore under foreign ownership, did not end AMT's significance. It ended AMT's presence. The significance continued, carried forward by the collector community that had formed around the kits, by the hobby press that documented their history, by the secondary market that assigned them value, by the children who had built them and could not quite let go of what that building had meant. The collector market for original AMT kits is today one of the strongest in the hobby. Original muscle car promotional models, the 1966 Pontiac GTO, the 1967 Ford Mustang, the 1969 Chevrolet Camaro, command prices in the hundreds of dollars in mint. Boxed condition. Original 3-in-1 Trophy Series kits from the early 1960s, unbuilt and complete, sell for more on auction sites than the average American worker earned in a week when the kits were first produced. The market is telling a story that the balance sheets never captured. These objects mattered. They still matter. The financial structures that produced them failed. The objects themselves endure, and the memory of building them endures alongside. But the lesson of the Detroit system is not simply that good products outlast the companies that made them. The lesson is structural, and it is uncomfortable. AMT built the most sophisticated promotional model operation in American history. It engineered its products to tolerances that rivaled the real vehicles they represented. It established relationships with the largest industrial corporations in the country. It created, with the 3-in-1 kit, a genuine innovation that transformed a sales tool into a hobby, and built a mass market where none had existed. And then it built walls around that market. The territorial system, AMT's Ford, Johannes Chrysler, MPC's GM, was not just a competitive arrangement, it was a dependency structure. Each company's survival depended on the continued health of its automaker relationship. When Ford pulled back from the promotional model program, AMT lost the foundation of its business. When Chrysler stopped valuing the dealer promotional, Johann lost its reason for existing. When GM consolidated its licensing arrangements, MPC's position shifted in ways that its management could not control. The Detroit model car companies had built their businesses on access to the automakers' designs, their specifications, their dealership networks, their annual model changes. That access was a privilege, not a right. And when the automakers decided, for their own reasons and on their own timelines, that the privilege was no longer worth extending, the companies that had structured themselves around it had nowhere to turn. George Toteff had understood this at some level. The Star Trek license, AMT's most important strategic move of the 1960s, was an attempt to build a product line that did not depend on Detroit's annual calendar, that reached customers whose enthusiasm was for science fiction rather than automotive culture, that could survive regardless of what Ford decided to do with its 1968 model year lineup. The truck kits were the same logic. The fire apparatus, the van kits of the 1970s. Each diversification was correct in its diagnosis and insufficient in its execution. Not because the products were wrong, the truck kits were excellent, the Star Trek line was extraordinary, but because the structural dependency on the Detroit relationship was too deep to be offset by catalog additions. AMT needed the automaker contracts to maintain the scale of operation that made its other product lines viable. When the contracts diminished, the scale diminished with them, and the economics of every other product line deteriorated accordingly. Tamiya had shown, by the late 1970s, what a model kit company looked like when it was not structurally dependent on a single industry's goodwill. The Japanese manufacturer had built its business on engineering excellence and a breadth of subjects: military vehicles, aircraft, ships, cars, figures, that spread its market risk across dozens of categories rather than concentrating it in one. Tamiya's customers were not primarily boys making allowance decisions at a hobby shop counter. They were modelers of all ages, in multiple countries, motivated by a passion for the craft rather than a connection to a specific automotive culture. AMT's business model had been brilliant for the world that produced it. It was not built for the world that followed. Johann knew this and could not adapt. MPC knew this and was absorbed before it had to answer the question. AMT knew this and tried, genuinely tried, with Star Trek and trucks and vans and fire trucks and NASA kits, and was acquired before the diversification could take hold. The Detroit system did not fail because the people who built it were foolish. It failed because the world it was built for changed faster than any of them could reasonably have anticipated. The annual model change that had driven the hobby market for 20 years slowed and then stopped being culturally significant. The dealership promotional model went from a competitive necessity to an expensive anachronism. The boys who had built annuals grew up. The boys who followed them wanted Atari. None of that was anyone's fault. All of it was everyone's problem. What the Detroit system left behind, beyond the collector market, beyond the round 2 reissues, beyond the tooling that survived when so much else did not, was a demonstration of what is possible when industrial production and cultural meaning occupy the same space. When the thing a factory makes is not merely a product, but a memory in waiting. When a 98-cent kit on a hobby shop shelf is also a relationship between a child and the world of adult things: cars, speed, craftsmanship, the satisfaction of making something with your hands that looks like something real. That relationship is what AMT built, in Troy, Michigan, on Maple Road, with steel dies and styrene plastic, and the annual rhythm of Detroit's model changes. The factory is gone. The relationship remains. Somewhere in America, there is a sealed AMT kit on a shelf, not a reproduction, not a round 2 reissue, an original. The box slightly yellowed at the corners, the cellophane window clouded with age, the price sticker still attached. 98 cents, or maybe $1.29 by the time this one was made. The box art shows the car in 3/4 profile, the way AMT always showed it. Hood up, engine visible, the custom and racing configurations illustrated in smaller panels along the side. Nobody has opened it. Maybe it was bought and set aside for a rainy day that never came. Maybe it was a birthday gift that arrived the week the kid discovered something else entirely. Maybe it was the last kit purchased before the hobby shop on the corner closed, and keeping it sealed became a way of keeping something else intact. The idea of the Saturday morning ritual, the smell of styrene and fresh cardboard, the specific quality of attention that building a model kit required and that nothing else in the culture quite replicated. The kit sits there. The factory that made it is gone. The Maple Road plant in Troy, Michigan was torn down years ago. The address exists only in corporate records and the memories of the men and women who worked there, the tool and die makers who cut the dies to George Toteff's specifications, the assembly line workers who painted the bodies and chrome-plated the bumpers and packaged the finished kits for the distribution trucks that carried them to hobby shops across the country. Some of those workers are still living. Most are not. The ones who remain carry the factory in their memories the way workers always carry the places that defined the middle decades of their lives, not as history, but as the texture of ordinary days that only become significant in retrospect. Wes Galagli opened his shop on 8 Mile Road in 1948 with a cast aluminum Ford and a connection to a car company. George Toteff turned that shop into a precision manufacturing operation and then into a cultural institution. Bud Anderson drove the kits across the country and put them in the hands of a generation. Don Beebe signed a contract at Dieselou Studios and gave 1 million kids a Starship to build. The tool and die workers whose names nobody recorded cut the dies that made all of it possible. And then Lesney came, and the plant closed, and the kits kept coming, from Baltimore, from Iowa, from South Bend. But the specific thing that the Troy plant had been, the particular combination of place and people, and institutional knowledge and accumulated history, was gone. Scattered the way AMT's documentary collection was scattered when Lesney moved production in 1978. Irretrievable not because the pieces were destroyed, but because the arrangement of them, the precise configuration of relationships and expertise and shared purpose that had made Maple Road something more than a manufacturing facility, could not be reconstructed. That is what factory closures actually cost. Not the building, not the machinery, the arrangement. The kit on the shelf does not know any of this. It sits in its original box with its original parts on their original sprues, waiting with the patience of an object that has no awareness of waiting. The 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1, the 1967 Chevrolet Camaro SS, the Peterbilt 359 with the Detroit diesel engine under the hood, the Enterprise kit number S921 with the battery compartment for the lights that most people never installed correctly, and that nobody minded because the ship looked right regardless. These objects carry something that their designers did not intend them to carry and could not have anticipated. They carry the weight of a particular American moment, the post-war decades when Detroit made cars that people felt something about, when a hobby shop on a Saturday morning was a genuine destination, when the annual arrival of the new kit catalog was an event worth planning around. That moment is over. It ended gradually through the 1970s and definitively through the 1980s, replaced by other moments, other rituals, other objects that carried their own meanings for the generations that followed. But the kit survived the moment, and the people who built them, the men and women now in their 60s and 70s who sat at kitchen tables with Testor's cement and a toothpick, and the instruction sheet spread flat beside the box, carry the memory of that building with a fidelity that surprised them when they encountered it again. A sealed kit at an estate sale, a round 2 reissue at a hobby shop that somehow still exists. The smell of styrene when someone opens a bag of parts in the same room. The memory arrives complete and immediate, the way the most important memories always do. AMT made that possible. A Troy, Michigan attorney with Ford connections and a side business. A pattern maker who thought in engineering terms and saw no difference between making cars and making miniatures of cars. A marketing man who drove the country calling himself the Cat. A sales representative who signed a contract for a Starship before the show had aired. And the workers. The ones who showed up every day on Maple Road and ran the tooling and pulled the parts and packaged the kits and loaded the trucks. Whose names are not in the corporate histories. Whose expertise is not documented in the trade press. Who built, with their hands and their knowledge and their ordinary working days, the objects that a generation of Americans still cannot quite let go of. The sealed kit on the shelf is their work. It always was. Wes Galagli, George Toteff, John Hanley across town at Joe Hahn. George Totef again at MPC, competing with the company he had built. Don Beebe and the Starship. Lesney, arriving from Britain with money and good intentions and no understanding of what they were buying. Erdel in Iowa, saving the tooling. Round 2 in South Bend, keeping it running. Troy, Michigan, 1948 to 1978. The factory is gone. The kit is still there. That is what AMT left behind. Not the corporate structure, not the promotional contracts, not the territorial arrangements with Ford and Chevrolet and Chrysler that organized the hobby market for 20 years. Not even the brand name, which has passed through so many hands, it has lost its connection to the place and the people who gave it meaning. What AMT left behind is in a box on a shelf somewhere in America. Unopened. Complete. Still 98 cents worth of possibility. Still waiting for someone to open it and begin.